Greetings, fellow traveller. Tired of the hardships of your journey? Here, take a seat by the fire and let me spin you a grim tale of a dark future where there is only war. Today we'll continue talking about the timeline of the galaxy and its many factions, with the rise of the Aeldari Empire and its great fall. As mentioned in the introduction video, the Aeldari are basically the classic fantasy elves, but in space. In fact, before they were called Eldar, but their name had to be changed since that name actually belongs to the Tolkien mythology, and let's just say that Games Workshop had some problems in the courts and finally had to change the name to Aeldari. In spite of that, we longtime fans still call them Eldar, so I do hope you'll forgive me if I use both terms interchangeably throughout the video. In the previous video about the Necrons, we already covered how the Aeldari were created by the Old Ones, but this time we're going to see it from their perspective. Most of the Eldar history was lost with their fall, and to this day it's very mixed up with mythology. The Aeldari language, being complex and with a lot of symbolic baggage and ambiguous meanings, makes it quite difficult to separate fact from myth and legend. Therefore, we're going to cover the two sides of the story, the facts according to the history and the allegorical version according to Eldar mythology. Without further ado, let's start with the historical facts, and for that, yet again, we'll have to go all the way back 60 million years to the War in Heaven. The origin of the Eldar came at the hands of their creators, the Old Ones, in an attempt to create a psychic warrior race capable of fighting back against the Cthulhu's eldritch powers and the unrelenting Necrons. Very little is known about their homeworld. It's said that the Aeldari emerged on a planet with 3 suns under the watchful eye of their creators. One could say that the Eldar won the galactic lottery, born without having to face the harsh path of evolution or compete for resources, since they were products of genetic manipulation and intelligent design of the semi-divine beings of great wisdom and power that were the Old Ones. The Eldar were endowed with slender, agile bodies and a strong connection to the warp to fight the Cthulhu with their psychic powers in the War in Heaven. As it turned out, warp energy was the only weakness of the Cthulhu. The Eldar don't remember much about their mysterious creators, but we do know they described them as beings of light and shadow, of great power and benevolence, and to the Eldar they were known as the First Ones. The Old Ones guided the Eldar to take their first steps, sharing technology and mentoring them in the nature of the warp and its use. Alas, they couldn't stay with them for long, as they had to return to the War in Heaven, and so the Old Ones departed, leaving the Eldar to continue growing on their own. Upon the return of their creators, the Aeldari saw that the war had left its mark on the Old Ones. Their ships bore great scars and signs of battle, their numbers had dwindled, and their mood was far greyer and gloomier. However, the Eldar weren't deterred by the dire omens their creators brought, and they joined the war, determined to prove their mettle. Thus, the Old Ones and the Aeldari fought side by side in the War in Heaven against the Cthulhu and the Necrons. During their training, the Aeldari had learnt to create constructs or golems inhabited by the energy of the warp, basically artificial demons or small deities to fight against the Star God's eldritch powers. With these artificial demons / sentient weapons and the powers of the warp that the Aeldari and the Old Ones were wielding, completely anathema to the powers of the Cthulhu, they were able to stem the tide for a while. In addition, the Old Ones had given the Aeldari one more trick. Upon death, their souls would simply go to the warp for a while to later reincarnate in another body, effectively creating the first perpetuals. It should be noted that during these ancient times, the warp isn't the hellscape it's become in M41, but rather it was calm and in harmony. The Sea of Souls was kind of a second home to the Eldar. They could bathe in the energies and currents of the warp harmlessly, and their souls were completely safe in this other realm. Their deep connection to the warp makes Eldar souls burn bright in the materium, and also Eldars feel emotion quite more intensely than most other races. Therefore, their emotions resonate much stronger in the warp, allowing them to feel their kin's psychic emanations of emotion almost as if they were their own, and being able to mold and shape the currents of the warp and the materium with their very emotion and their wills to a very great extent. At some point during the War in Heaven, we know that the Old Ones were almost completely wiped out by the plague of the warp predators known as the Enslavers, but we don't know how the Aeldari survived. Some speculate that the Old Ones merged with the Eldar psychic golems, leaving their flesh bodies behind and becoming gods. Others believe that the golems, without the management of the Old Ones, began to lose control and merge with one another, and the collective psychic energy eventually coalesced into the Aeldari pantheon. Whichever the case, the Aeldari now had gods of their own who could fight one-on-one against the Catan on equal terms. Thus, the Eldar gods stepped in to fill the void left behind by the Old Ones, leading the Old Ones' creations that had survived against the Necrons. During the War in Heaven, the Aeldari were led by Eldanesh and Ulthanesh, great heroes of legend capable of summoning Eldari gods to the material realm single-handedly. These gods are described in some passages as huge titans that dominated the battlefield like mountains. After the shattering of the Catan, the Necrons were weak, and the Eldar began to gain the upper hand, eventually forcing them into their great slumber. The Eldar had won the war for which they had been created. Alas, they had lost their creators along the way, and now they had the galaxy all to themselves. This would be the external view of the events, the factual, quote-unquote, historical view. But, as I mentioned before, the Aeldari have their own myth of creation, although not much of it remains and even the Eldar consider it unreliable. Those very few who still remember or have records of such ancient times actually know how to tell the truth from the myth. In a vast generalization, Eldar mythology is quite similar to Greek mythology in terms of the roles of each deity, and in that they behave like one big dysfunctional family with a lot of drama all over the place. Before we start, I'm not going to go into detail about the history of each god, but before we talk about the mythology, I'd like to name them and at least give a brief description so that we know what's going on. Also, quick disclaimer, yes, I'm about to completely butcher most of these names, so for you Eldar fans out there, it's probably a good idea to cover your knife ears. Asurion, also known as the Phoenix King, was the king of the Aeldari pantheon, kind of like Zeus, although not that much of a playboy. Asurion mainly maintained the balance between the other gods and acted as a judge in case of conflict. His main symbols are fire and light. Sigorach, or Kegorach, I never know how to pronounce this guy's name, also known as the Laughing God, the Great Trickster, the Great Jester, or the First Jester, is the Eldar god of deception, stealth, creativity, art and cunning. Kayla Mencha Kane is the Eldar god of war, murder, violence and destruction. He is probably the most powerful Eldar god in terms of brute force, and he's one of the few Eldar gods that survived the fall. Isha is the goddess of fertility, life, healing, harvest and mother of the Eldar species. Kronos is the god of the hunt, father of the Eldari race and husband of Isha. Gaia, or Gia, is the next goddess on the list, however we only know that she was consort of Cain and Asurion, but just by her name we could guess that she would be the goddess of nature or something similar. Lilith, or Lilith, also called the Maiden, is the goddess of fortune and dreams and is known for her prophecies. Morai Heg, also known as the Crone, is the goddess of destiny and death. She is the third in a trinity of female Eldari goddesses, also including Lilith the Maiden and Isha. Eldar mythology stated that Morai Heg kept the fate of all mortals inside a skin rune pouch. The next god on the list is Hoek, although we don't really know what this god embodied. All we know is that it's a deity worshipped by Eldar assassins known as Pathfinders. Hoek is said to be one with the webway, constantly wandering the paths between planets since the stars themselves were young. Vol is the god of forging and smithing and the brother of Asurion. Inyad is the Eldar god of the dead. This god has only ever been spoken of in myth and legend, but hasn't fully been born in the warp yet. It's believed it's formed by the collective souls of the Eldar contained in the Infinity Circuits, and when every last Eldar has finally died, their souls will combine to form Inyad, a god powerful enough to finally defeat Slaanesh and free the Eldar race from their torment. Apart from these main gods worshipped by most of the Eldar race, the Exodites also worship different deities. The Cobra God, a creature of pure destruction that cares not or what is caught in its wake, the Scorpion God, an animalistic spirit of defense, brother of the Cobra, and the Serpent God, a creature of secrets and knowledge that knows all there is to know in the entire universe. Now that we know who their gods are and what roles they had, we're ready to dive into the Eldar creation myth. The myth of creation states that the Eldar are descendants of Isha, goddess of life and fertility, and Kronos, god of the hunt, who sired Eldrathane and Ulthanesh. Eldrathane is said to be the first leader of the Aeldari, who along his brother Ulthanesh won many victories over the Huresh Shalane, a race they fought against supposedly before being recruited in the War in Heaven. So I'm guessing this would be in the time period when the Old Ones left their children home alone, and apparently the Aeldari went out to play with the other aliens in the neighbourhood, but it seems they didn't make many friends. Jokes aside, the Eldar myth states, when the Eldar first rose from the bosom of the ground, nourished by the tears of Isha, the gods came to them and each offered them a gift. Asuryan, Lord of Lords, gave the Eldar wisdom that they would know themselves. Isha gave the Eldar love, that they would know one another. Vol gave the Eldar artifice, that they would make their dreams a reality. Lilith gave the Eldar joy, that they would know happiness. Kuranos gave the Eldar desire, that they would know prosperity. Morai Heg gave the Eldar foresight, that they would know their place in the world. Cain gave the Eldar anger, that they would protect what the gods had given them. One day, Lilith, goddess of dreams and fortune, had a prophetic dream in which the Eldar would cause the destruction of Cain. Lilith was known for her foresight, so Cain took it very seriously and decided to wipe out the entire Eldar race rather than let them destroy him. Isha, who could not bear to see her children slaughtered, asked Asuryan, who up to now was watching the massacre unfold without intervening, to stop him. We don't know if Asuryan didn't take action because he was impassive towards the massacre, in shock, overwhelmed, or a mixture of all three. However, upon hearing Isha's voice, he came out of his catatonic state and agreed that stopping the god of war from massacring all the mortals was probably a good idea. Thus, he created a barrier between gods and mortals, isolating the pantheon in the warp and forbidding the rest of the gods from manifesting in reality, and banning any other kind of interaction and communication between gods and mortals. However, this proved to be too much for Isha and Kronos, who apparently were too fond of their children, who couldn't bear to abandon them and leave them to their fate. Thus, they went to take their sorrows to their friend Vol, the smithing god. Vol sympathized with their story and lent himself to help them, creating the soul stones so that they could communicate with the Eldar. Through these stones, communication between mortals and gods resumed. Isha and Kronos continued to teach and tutor the Eldar in secret, and they all lived happily ever after. I'm kidding, there's no such thing as happily ever after in 40k. One unfortunate day, Cain caught Isha and Kronos on a Zoom call with the Eldar and ran to tell Asuryan that they had broken his decree. Though Asuryan sympathized with them, he had no choice but to punish them for their transgressions, and so he accepted Cain's wishes, and the god of war took them into his custody to do with them as he pleased. Cain tortured both of them with all the cruel arts he knows, and being a god of war, one can imagine he was quite thorough indeed. Many other gods viewed Cain's actions as completely barbaric. It simply shouldn't be allowed. Alas, none of them had enough valor to speak up. Only one amongst them had the guts to do something about it. Vol, god of smiths. Vol negotiated with Cain for the freedom of his friends, and they finally came to an agreement. Cain would free Kronos and Isha in 1 year in exchange for 100 swords. A single sword crafted by Vol was incredibly valuable. It's said a mortal wielding one of Vol's swords could face 1,000 wielding normal swords. And so, Vol got to work, content about being able to free his friends. Alas, when the year was over and the time of the exchange came upon him, Vol had only been able to make 99 swords. So he took a mortal sword instead and mixed it in with his, thinking the god of war wouldn't notice. And to begin with, he was right. Cain was so delighted with his new swords, he didn't stop to examine their quality, and honouring his part of the bargain, he freed Kronos and Isha immediately. Nevertheless, it wouldn't take long for Cain to notice. With a burst of rage, he called Vol traitor, liar, and thief, and declared war against him, and so began a civil war in the Eldar pantheon. Their very own war in heaven that split the gods in two sides in a great conflict that supposedly went on for an eternity. Meanwhile, in the mortal realm, the Eldar mirrored their gods and began fighting one another, taking sides with one god or another. The only one who didn't partake in the war was Asuryan, deeply regretting having punished his brothers and the tragedy it had led to. In an effort to end the war once and for all, Vol forged the last and best of the 100 swords, a mighty blade known as Anaris, and marched to face Cain in single combat. It was a legendary battle, but even with the best of his swords, he was no match for the god of war, and once Cain defeated him, he mutilated his body and chained it to his anvil. In the meantime, an ally of Vol took Anaris and gave it to Eldanish so he could face Cain. Like Vol before him, Eldanish wielded Anaris and marched to duel Cain. And, well, how to put it? If Vol, who is a literal god, wielded the same weapon and couldn't beat Cain, what on earth made this mere mortal think he could ever stand a chance against the god of war? Surprise, surprise, Cain thrashed him and ended crushing him in his hand. The legends say Eldanish fought well, but let's be honest here, I seriously doubt he had any chances whatsoever from the get-go. When Cain slayed Eldanish, his hand began bleeding and never stopped. Thus, from that moment onwards, he would be known as Kala Mensha Cain. Cain, the bloody-handed god. Asuryan, tired of all the bloodshed this war had caused, had finally had enough and proclaimed the end of the war. Cain, now satisfied with his vengeance and his super cool bleeding hand, accepted Asuryan's decree and the war finally came to an end. All in all, this is the other side of the events of the origin of the Eldar race told by Eldar mythology. Both seem to mix and connect at some points, but as mentioned before, not even the Eldar know their own history. Their myths aren't just metaphors or a factual reality of events, for their language is highly symbolic and complex. Each word has a multitude of meanings and different connotations. Complicated as this hot mess may be, we can still make a few conclusions. The Eldar were indeed created by the Old Ones during the War in Heaven to fight the Necrons and the Catan, and they were led by Eldanish and Ulthanish, powerful heroes who could summon their gods or artificial demons into the battlefield as sentient weapons of mass destruction. Somehow, the Eldar survived the War in Heaven, the Enslaver Plague, and their own gods' tantrums. Finally, the galaxy was at peace, and the stars were theirs for the taking. The Eldar began expanding at great speed, but before establishing their great stellar empire, they had a few problems with other races since, as it turns out, at one point they were even enslaved by another race. Truth be told, they had it quite difficult without the Old Ones' guidance and protection, and they no longer had access to the webway since the Old Ones had deactivated it, fearing the Necrons would take it over. And so, the Eldar had to cross the galaxy by their own means, seeking every webway portal they could to reactivate it and get the Galactic Highway back online. The webway is probably the Eldar's main advantage over any and all other species in the galaxy. Existing between the material realm and the warp, it doesn't obey traditional laws of physics, thus making it the fastest way there is to cross the vast interstellar void, allowing the Eldar to move from one point of the galaxy to the other in what feels like the blink of an eye. While other races have to rely on travelling at a fraction of the speed of light from one system to another or risking warp travel, the Eldar achieve FTL travel by simply using the many myriad paths of the webway. This allows them to deploy their forces at incredible speed and withdraw if needed with the same haste before the enemy can even react or has time to travel to the location they hit. Ultimately, the webway is the Eldar's legacy they inherited from the Old Ones. It keeps their domains linked and well communicated, allowing them to travel the stars faster than any other, and arguably is their greatest weapon. Once the webway was up and running again, the Eldar spread rapidly throughout the galaxy, establishing a great empire known as the Empire of 10 Million Suns. The greatness of their empire knew no limits. They developed the technology they received from the Old Ones to the point where they eclipsed other races and pushed any threats to their domain to the borders of their realm. The hallmark of Eldar technology is a material known as Wraithbone, one they inherited from the Old Ones, a light yet strong building material that seems more akin to organic tissue rather than an inert material, growing and reacting to its environment like some kind of plant. Like most Eldar tech, Wraithbone is based on psychometric engineering. In other words, materials that can be manipulated with psychic powers. Anything and everything from moulding Wraithbone with their minds to create wonders of architecture, to turning the light on with a mere thought. At this point in time, the Eldar were so advanced they could create their own custom solar systems, terraforming planets to turn them into perfect worlds of pure harmony and undescribable beauty. Life was good for the Eldar, very good indeed. They lived in a post-scarcity society where they could all simply live without having to work nor worry about anything at all. It's said that during this period, the Eldar had gods for every task, blessed with the ability to create them through their psychic powers and belief, intentionally making their own gods that covered all their needs. Maybe these indeed were entities created by the Eldar for all and any purpose, or on the other hand, maybe they were more akin to psychic constructs, sentient psychic entities willed into existence by the Eldar collective belief and willpower, inhabiting material bodies of Wraithbone to be able to interact with the material world. Whichever the case, these entities / psychic constructs plus sophisticated robots and presumably AI covered all their needs to the point that almost every task was automized. The Eldar didn't even need to colonize new planets by themselves. They could just send colony ships on autopilot and there you have it, another world for the Empire. During this Golden Age period, Eldar very rarely had to war with other races, and in any case, they had constructs to do that for them too. But in all honesty, there were no enemies that could match their might. They had no resource scarcity and they didn't even have to work. This golden age of peace and prosperity lasted for millions upon millions of years, during which the Eldar could relax and enjoy the true pleasures of life, delving into philosophy and arts like theatre, dance or fine arts. So much time did the Eldar have for leisure that they eventually turned to hedonism, pursuing pleasure and personal satisfaction above all. This would lead to the emergence of small cults known as cults of excess that spawned in the heart of the Eldar Empire and soon began to multiply across society. Slowly but surely, their pursuit of pleasure became ever more obsessive, depraved and perverted. That which in the beginning would suffice to satisfy their desires, in time wouldn't be enough to quench their thirst. And so, what began as a night of passion between lovers turned into complete debauchery, orgies full of all the twisted pleasures you can imagine, sensation-enhancing drugs, and blood sacrifices in perverse and dark rituals. Some Eldar could foresee the great cataclysm their behaviour would bring upon them, and many sought to exile themselves from society, setting on worlds on the fringes of their empire to get far away from the decadence of their people. Furthermore, they would even renounce their technologies to live their lives away from the excess and pleasure that came with commodity. Meanwhile, the cults of excess continued expanding and gaining power and influence until they became the norm and even Eldar aristocracy joined them. Some Farseers had visions of the tragedy these actions would bring, and even more had decided to flee from the perversion that had possessed their people, embarking on great self-sustaining vessels that simulated mobile planets, known as Craftworlds, travelling into the dark depths of space to escape the temptations of pleasure. Those who remained in the heart of the Eldar Empire, now free from the voices of the more conservative and rational amongst them, let loose completely, Killers, rapists, lunatics and worse run free in blood-soaked streets where the Eldar indulged in their darkest desires like true madmen. The dark pleasures of the Eldar knew no limits. It's not clearly stated in the lore what exactly they got up to, but I believe it's fair to assume they got quite creative with their sex toys, used all kinds of aphrodisiacs and substances to stimulate themselves and one another, partook in planetary scale orgies, and other more taboo things ending in philia, phagia or ism that I'm not going to get into detail here because YouTube would probably ban me for life. So let's just say they were completely sick in the mind, perverse, and their debauchery knew no limits. Jokes aside, not everything had to do with sex, of course. The Eldar enjoyed all kinds of excesses and pleasures. There were great feasts that eventually led to cannibalism, or musicians that would start enjoying the pleasures of music in all its complexity and depth, and ended up playing instruments made of organs, tendons, and bones. All of this decadence began generating a great amount of negative energy in the warp that in time would coalesce into the fourth Chaos God, Slaanesh. The birth cry of Slaanesh opened a tear in the fabric of reality that leaked warp energy into the galaxy, creating a gargantuan warp storm that swallowed the heart of the Eldar Empire in its entirety, annihilating thousands upon thousands of worlds and millions of Eldar lives in one fell swoop. The Eldar had lost most of their empire in a mere instant, but that wasn't the worst part. Shortly after her birth, Slaanesh tore into the Eldar Heaven, and a second war took place in Eldar Heaven. This time, more than a war, it was a complete massacre. Slaanesh slayed most of the Eldar Pantheon in mere moments. None could rival her power. Kegrak managed to escape thanks to his trickery and slipped into the safety of the Webway, while Khaine fought Slaanesh one-on-one. Their battle was truly legendary, the god of war against the incarnation of the Eldar's darkest dreams. However, Slaanesh was too empowered by the billions of Eldar souls she had consumed, and eventually managed to defeat and subdue Khaine. Alas, Khaine wasn't for Slaanesh to slay, for there can only be one god of war, and Khorne wouldn't have it any other way. And so Khorne battled his new and young sibling for Khaine to reclaim him as his own property. During the struggle between the two Chaos Gods, Khaine was driven to the material realm and shattered into 1,000 pieces. The only other Eldar god that survived the massacre was Isha. She too would be Slaanesh's captive until one of her pleas for help was finally heard by another Chaos God, Nurgle, god of decay, pestilence and plague. Nurgle came to her aid and fought a war against the newly arrived Slaanesh, and after achieving victory, took Slaanesh with him as his own prisoner. Now and forevermore, Isha dwells in Nurgle's lair, so that Nurgle can test his latest plagues and diseases he brews in his cauldron before setting them loose upon the galaxy, and Isha is the perfect subject. Since she's the goddess of life, she heals all the damage and ill effects of each disease Nurgle gives her, allowing the plague god to see which ones work best without losing his test subject in the process. It's said Isha whispers the cures of Nurgle's diseases in the corners of the galaxy, hoping someone will hear them and put an end to Nurgle's latest concoctions. In this great cataclysm known as the Fall, Slaanesh consumed the souls of the vast majority of the Eldar race, creating an enormous tear in reality, a great warp storm where the heart of the Eldar Empire used to be. This warp storm, spanning thousands of light years, later would become known as the Eye of Terror or the Ocularis Terribus. The Eldar worlds swallowed by the warp storm were annihilated in a matter of seconds, overrun by demons or turned into demon worlds. The Aeldari living on worlds near the epicenter of this newly created Eye of Terror lost their minds in the instant Slaanesh was born, driven hopelessly mad, attacking both their fellow cultists as well as the sacrifices of their dark rituals. Another large portion of the population near Ground Zero died from the psychic backlash of so many billions of Eldar dying at once. Being deeply connected to the warp, they could feel the huge loss, pain and suffering of all those millions that had died in mere moments. The few Eldar not affected by the fall were those who fled the decadence of their empire or those who lived in the depths of the Webway. However, their misfortune doesn't end there, since creating a Chaos God has even far deeper consequences. Upon her birth, Slaanesh claimed all the souls of the Aeldari race, and from now on, any Aeldari soul upon death is directly consumed by Slaanesh. No rebirth or protection from their gods, since they were all dead or hidden away, just an eternity of suffering, being devoured by the Chaos God of dark pleasure and pain. This introduced a very new idea to the Aeldari race, the fear of death. They would have to live the rest of their existence with the certainty that after death, their soul would be devoured and tortured by the god of dark pleasures. Not a very promising prospect, if you ask me. The Aeldari never fully recovered from the fall, and ever since, they've been on the verge of extinction. Their reproductive cycles and gestation periods were too long to repopulate the Empire at the necessary rate, and they were resigned to hide in the corners of the galaxy away from the depredations of Slaanesh. So the Aeldari quite literally screwed themselves, and if I haven't made it clear enough to what extent, think that before the fall they lived lives of pleasure, leisure and peace where all their basic needs were met by automatons, and after living long lives of thousands of years and finally dying, their souls would harmlessly bathe in the energies of the warp, or maybe go to some kind of Aeldari heaven until they could reincarnate and live it all over again. On the other hand, now they have been decimated to the point of near extinction, they've lost their mighty empire and an important part of their technology, they're forced to live in the shadows of the galaxy in hiding like outcasts, their gods are dead or missing, and now, when they die, their souls are devoured by the Chaos God of BDSM. To put it mildly, it's not looking very good for the Eldar, to be honest. After the fall, the Eldar have been divided into different groups with different lifestyles and objectives. Each group has developed their own particular way of dealing with their new existence, resulting in very different societies. The different factions are the following: the Craftworld Eldar, or Asuryani as they call each other, the Dark Eldar or Drukhari, the Exodites, the Corsairs, the Harlequins, and finally the Inari. However, in this video I'm only going to focus on the Craftworld Eldar and the Drukhari because they're the biggest factions, and later on I'll make a different video about the different sub-factions. So with that said, let's start with those who exiled themselves from their empire to avoid the fall, the Craftworld Eldar. The Craftworld Eldar are the Puritans who, after heeding a prophecy from their seers about the fall of the Eldar race, and seeing the depths of degeneration and debauchery that took place in the Empire, decided to exile themselves in large ships and depart from the pits of perversion. The Craftworlds are literally what you'd imagine, enormous ships the size of planets that house all kinds of ecosystems and biospheres that provide all the necessary resources to supply its inhabitants. Therefore, Craftworlds are totally self-sustainable and self-sufficient, being able to navigate the cosmos indefinitely without having to stop for food or quote-unquote gas. It's said that before the fall, some Eldar already sailed these great ships as traders or merchants, travelling from planet to planet and system to system to trade with their goods. Travelling at a fraction of the speed of light, these mighty ships took a long time to reach their destinations. This, in turn, gave them time to see how their civilization was decaying. Imagine that you're a pre-fall Craftworld Eldar, a simple merchant among your people that has no idea what's going on back home. One day you arrive to a planet where you have family, a cousin for example, and you decide to pay him a visit because it's been thousands of years since you last saw him. When you open the door of his apartment, you see bodies hanging from the ceiling and walls on hooks and sharp spikes, and all kinds of unnecessarily complicated and harmful BDSM equipment. And you find your cousin just chilling in a jacuzzi full of blood and Eldar body parts with 5 other lightly clad Eldari you don't recognize, all of them high as a kite on space LSD. And when he sees you come in, he casually just says, "Hey cousin, how you doing? Come, join us in the tub." And you, horrified, try to suppress your gags while you try to get out of there without getting stuck to the mixture of bodily fluids on the floor. And to be honest, if the rest of the Aeldari aboard the Craftworld witnessed something similar, no wonder they made the reasonable decision to get on their ships and get the hell out of dodge of the Empire without looking back, resigned to wander amongst the stars, away from their homeworlds and most of their degenerate race. But hey, all in all, this is just my personal educated guess. Before going into exile, some Craftworlders rescued tomes of history and knowledge of their culture, and once on their mobile worlds, devised a new way of life to control their emotions and impulses to prevent a second fall. This new system would be known as the Paths. Each Eldar would choose an aspect of life, a discipline, to train to perfection, and once they had studied and perfected one path, they could take up another, and then another, and another after that. This could be any kind of discipline, from cooking, art, philosophy, or warfare, but always very specific things, effectively turning the Craftworlders into a society of specialists. Since Eldars have very long lifespans which can exceed 10,000 years, they can walk many paths throughout their lives. This gives them plenty of time to explore the different aspects of life and gather a wide variety of skills and a sophisticated understanding of both themselves and the galaxy. In other cases, some Eldar can become obsessed with a specific discipline, always striving for perfection without being able to find it, never satisfied with their level of mastery. It's said that these Eldar have lost their way and are trapped on their path. This is the case of the Exarchs, warriors who became obsessed with perfecting a field of warfare and resigned themselves to an eternity of bloodshed, which is seen by others as a great tragedy and loss to their people. Thanks to this path system, Craftworld Eldar managed to limit their temptations and emotions, and in turn offer less sustenance to Slaanesh. Craftworlders also came up with a brilliant idea to escape the hellhole that awaited them after death. Remember the soul stones mentioned in Eldar myth that were used by the gods to talk to the Eldar? Well, now they use these stones to store their souls after death. Soul stones are usually part of Craftworld Eldar armor, or they can be worn as a pendant or attached to their body in some way or form, so that if they die in battle or in any other unexpected circumstance, their soul is stored in the stone. Furthermore, once captured in the soul stones can be attached to a structure known as an infinity circuit, which is basically a great repository where all the souls of the dead of a Craftworld or a particular Aeldari settlement are stored. In this way, the souls of their dead can access an artificial heaven or quote-unquote afterlife, resting in peace, or if needed, communicating and guiding the Aeldari with their wisdom and knowledge. In fact, this faction is the most numerous of the Aeldari not because of the living, but for the number of souls of their ancestors who are still active. Aside from resting in peace and giving the living counsel in times of need, spirit stones can also be used to pilot wraithbone bodies and resurrect fallen warriors so they can fight once again in the ranks of their Craftworld, such is the case of the Wraithguard, the Wraithlord, or even Eldar Titans. Though normally, the Aeldari let the souls of the dead rest in peace in their infinity circuits and only bring their warriors back to this kind of artificial life when it's absolutely necessary. The psychic powers of the Craftworld Eldar have waned compared to their origins when they fought alongside the Old Ones, but still they remain some of the most powerful psykers in the galaxy. Very few psykers from other races across the galaxy can rival the Craftworld Eldar trained in the use of psychic powers, although since the fall they prefer not to abuse their psychic powers so as not to attract the attention of She Who Thirsts. Most of the Craftworld Eldar technology is warp-based, in other words, designed to be used with psychic powers. Eldar tech is often so advanced and sophisticated it's something more akin to magic or sorcery than science. Despite having lost the means to manufacture the technological wonders they enjoyed in their empire, they still possess some of the artifacts from their golden age. However, they prefer not to use them, fearing the great destructive power they could unleash and the consequences it would have for them. Craftworld Eldar are now fighting a war for their very souls. They can't allow themselves to fall back into the temptations of hedonism, so they believe it's better to embrace a life of self-control, hard work, and sacrifice. However, this doesn't mean that they don't innovate in their technology, but when they do, they must be extremely cautious as to not fall into the temptation of complacency as their ancestors did. The trademarks of Aeldari technology, apart from their wraithbone and their elegant and slender designs, are their fast spaceships, their anti-gravity tanks and transports, and their shuriken weaponry. These shuriken weapons fire tiny razor-sharp crystals at incredible speeds that tear through enemies like paper and can fire bursts of several crystals in a fraction of a second. Craftworld Eldar are usually ruled by a council of seers. The Seer Council interpret their visions of the future to lead the Aeldari on the right path, although it should be noted that each craftworld acts independently from each other, and if their interests were to clash, they could even take up arms in order to achieve their goals, but it's quite rare that tensions would escalate so far. These seers are very powerful Eldar psykers who are trained to unravel the many threads in the skein of fate, looking through the myriad different paths of the future to guide their people to the best possible outcome. However, when they take the wrong path or misinterpret a prophecy, their mistakes can bring very grave consequences for them and the rest of the galaxy. Craftworld Eldar view themselves as the true inheritors of their mighty empire of old, considering themselves pure and unstained by the sins that brought about their fall. The chiefest reason why these Eldar believe themselves to be the true heirs of their empire and thus view themselves as righteous is due to something we mentioned before that happened during the fall. Remember Cain's shards that were spread throughout the galaxy? It turns out that little by little they found their way into the hearts of different craft worlds. Though diminished, Cain still existed, and he'd chosen the Craftworld Eldar as the bearers and protectors of his last fragments. These fragments or shards can be used in a ritual to summon an avatar of Cain, and so the god of war could once more fight side by side with the Eldar in times of need. So if Craftworld Eldar already came off as terribly arrogant because they think themselves to be so pure, this just confirmed their beliefs even further and led to crown themselves as pure in the eyes of the gods and the true legitimate heirs of their empire. Now, the main goal of Craftworld Eldar is to defeat Chaos, or in their words, the Great Enemy, and save their race from extinction. To do so, they raid abandoned or destroyed Eldar worlds, or those consumed by the Eye of Terror, in search of soulstones or infinity circuits to recover the souls of their lost ancestors, and they fight Chaos on every front, sometimes even going as far as creating temporary alliances with other races and even the Imperium of Man, if it means dealing a decisive blow to the Great Enemy. The Dark Eldar, or Drukhari, are the depraved Eldar who, despite leading to a galactic scale catastrophe, creating a Chaos God and pushing their race towards extinction, still embrace their darkest desires. Those who would become the Dark Eldar were safe from the fall, either because they were far away from the epicenter or because they were inside the webway and protected from the psychic backlash. Nowadays, if they want to continue indulging their depraved nature, which they very much do, they must carry on doing so in the webway, far away from the influence and attentions of Slaanesh. This led most of them to seek shelter in the dark city of Commorragh in the depths of the webway. And yes, I know what you're thinking, this is a very clear reference to the biblical Sodom and Gomorrah, but just to be clear, both of those cities pale in comparison to Commorragh. When the cults of excess started to appear in the Eldar Empire, they were initially frowned upon. Thus, some would hide in the webway to satisfy their desires away from the Puritans' reach. And after the fall, those Eldar who wanted to keep the party going were inevitably forced into the webway. Before the fall, Commorragh was the biggest port city that connected the tunnels of the webway, a great hub where one could access any part of the galaxy. But after the fall, Commorragh turned into the lair of the followers of the cults of excess, and soon it would be known by its new infamous title, the Dark City. Those who dwell in Commorragh are nothing like their noble Craftworld king. Apart from the fact that they are depraved, perverted, drug addicts, criminals, and psychopaths, they don't use soul stones, and upon death their souls are directly consumed by Slaanesh. Furthermore, since they are constantly indulging in their dark pleasures, their souls are constantly being drained by Slaanesh every second of their lives. Such is the price they pay for their continued depravity. As a Dark Eldar Codex puts it, if the essence of an Eldar is the water in a cup, Slaanesh is always sipping away, and if nothing is done, the Eldar in question will be completely consumed, and slowly but surely, his body will become an empty and shriveled husk. This is one of the reasons why the Eldar call Slaanesh she who thirsts. This is also why the Dark Eldar must seek refuge in the webway. Being a realm between reality and the warp, Slaanesh's reach is partially mitigated. If it weren't for the webway's protection, Dark Eldar would be consumed at a much higher rate. However, the Drukhari have found kind of a loophole in their dark deal with She Who Thirsts and have come up with their own way to survive. The Dark Eldar discovered that causing pain and suffering to others will refresh their very bodies and life essence until Slaanesh slowly drains them again and the process begins anew. This turned out to be right up the Dark Eldar's alley, since before the fall they were already into all kinds of tortures, sacrifices, dark rituals and drugs to open the doors of perception. And now they found out that they can keep the party going indefinitely. The only downside is that Dark Eldar are truly terrified of death, for they know Slaanesh is waiting for them. Thus, Dark Eldar are forced to continue torturing and indulging in excess in all its forms if they don't want to meet Slaanesh face to face someday. So basically, they've boxed themselves into quite a literal vicious circle they're doomed to repeat over and over again. In order to keep the juices flowing to Slaanesh and their bodies and souls intact, time and again they have to leave their lair and raid the worlds of the galaxy to find slaves to torture, sacrifices for their rituals, guinea pigs for their twisted experiments, and decent candidates for their gladiatorial arenas. These raids will target the most vulnerable worlds that usually have poor or few defences, as Drukhari aren't keen on big dragged out conflicts because that would mean expending resources and more of them might die. And since dying leads to eternal BDSM sessions with Slaanesh with no safe word, they prefer performing lightning strikes from webway portals close to their targets, and throw a festival of slaughter and fill their ships with all the poor slaves they can, who have no idea how much they're going to wish they were dead once they reach Kamorah. Why would they wish that, I hear you ask? Well, let's just say that not only have the Drukhari truly mastered torture because their lives literally depend on it, but they've become incredibly skilled in keeping their victims alive for the longest times possible, whilst inflicting the maximum amount of pain their bodies will tolerate without harming any vital organs, as to extract the most amount of pain from them as possible. In this way, they can keep victims alive for months or even years, living off their psychic emanations of pain, filling Kamorah with cries of agony and suffering in twisted symphonies. Anyone in their right mind might think that the Drukhari feel guilty for the fall and might be ashamed to see themselves reduced to parasites feeding off the psychic emanations of pain of other races. But quite the contrary, they take pride in it. Far from feeling guilty for the tragedy their actions caused, they rejoice and celebrate their lives of excess and freedom, and view their Craftworld kin as primitive Puritans who deny their own nature and the freedom and pleasures of life that are their birthright. Unlike their Craftworld kin, the Drukhari's psychic powers have atrophied over millennia of living in the confines of the webway, isolated from the warp, and in any case, if a normal Eldar's psychic energy would draw the attention of Slaanesh, a Drukhari's psychic energy would be like ringing the dinner bell, nay, the dinner gong, for She Who Thirsts. Although they can still use some of their warp-based technology, the Drukhari began developing newer technologies and twisting the different fields of science in their favour, reaching unimaginable heights. Dark Eldar technology is quite arguably one of the most advanced in the entire galaxy, probably second to the Necrons and followed closely by Craftworld Eldar and the Tau. The Drukhari have some of the fastest ships and vehicles in the entire galaxy, allowing them to carry out hit-and-run tactics and lightning strike assaults and raids, and getting back to the webway before anyone notices or reacts fast enough to catch them. On top of that, Dark Eldar wield all kinds of exotic weapons designed to cause the maximum amount of pain possible, and mind-blowing over-the-top things like grenades that contain miniature black holes, allowing the user to just hurl one towards the enemy and watch as they're hopelessly devoured into the abyss. All in all, Dark Eldar tech is just out of this world. They possess other kinds of impressive weapons and technology that I don't have time to cover today, but we'll get to them in future videos at some point. Drukhari hierarchy is organised in groups that are halfway between a cartel, a pirate crew and a noble house known as cabals. Each cabal can be composed of thousands of crazed killers, pirates, mercenaries, psychopaths, torturers, and all kinds of undesirables. The cabal seized power in Kamorah a long time ago. Now they're in a constant struggle between each other to gain more power and influence than the rest. The most powerful cabal is the Cabal of the Black Heart, ruled by Asdrugal Vect. Vect is the de facto ruler of Kamorah, and the technical leader of the Drukhari. Each cabal is ruled by an Archon, a Dark Eldar of the most untrustworthy and cruel nature. Skilled enough as to not get backstabbed by their kin, these Archons hold enough power and resources to organise their own raids and enslave entire worlds if they wish. If it weren't already obvious, Dark Eldar and Craftworld Eldar do not get along at all. We could go as far as to say they harbour a deep hatred towards each other. The Drukhari view the Craftworlders as weaklings obsessed with the past who are missing out on the pleasures of excess life has to offer, and the Craftworld Eldar view their Dark King as depraved savages and ultimately the culprits of the fall of their once great empire. Although there's quite a variety of different Eldar with different behaviours and lifestyles, in general they all share the great sense of pride and arrogance, believing themselves superior to all other life in the galaxy. Humans particularly are seen as primitive barbarians and are generally despised by all Eldar. Humans are referred to as Monkey by Eldar, and granted, yes, it does sound incredibly similar to monkey and kind of seems like a racial slur, which it kind of is to be honest, but in the lore, the Eldar word Monkey is used to describe the species that has been deemed inferior and in need of extermination. Some Eldar can speak Gothic without any issues at all, but prefer not to do so since it would be repulsive to sully their tongue with such a primitive and guttural language. To the Eldar, humans are a primitive and a barbaric race, too naive to understand the dangers of chaos, doomed to repeat the Eldar's fall and spawn another Chaos God. Which is kind of weird because humans aren't engaging in galaxy-wide blood orgies. Also, it comes off as quite hypocritical and ironic coming from them, given they spawned the Chaos God of dark pleasures and BDSM, and thanks to them, now Slaanesh and all her demons will haunt all mortals in the galaxy forevermore, so maybe they're not the ones to be giving lessons to anyone. All jokes aside though, mankind was on the verge of creating their own Chaos God during the Horus Heresy. I'm not going to get much into it here to avoid spoilers, but let's just say maybe the Eldar are half right. Mankind almost did repeat the Eldar's fall during the 30th millennium, but maybe not as much during the 41st. Sure, the Emperor is worshipped throughout the Imperium as a god and has been for thousands of years, but in my opinion, if he were to ever ascend to divinity, he wouldn't necessarily turn out to be a chaotic god. Anyway, I think I'm going down a rabbit hole here, and all this speculation about the Emperor's divinity is yet again another subject for a different video. Getting back on track, most Eldar see humans as vermin, and although the Imperium also abhors dealing with Xenos, some circumstances do warrant temporary alliances between the Imperium and the Eldar, like for example bigger threats such as Necrons, Chaos, or the Tyranids. However, thus doesn't mean the Eldar can be trusted. They will gladly have millions of humans killed without breaking sweat if that means they could save even a handful of their own. Also, Eldar are well known for their deceptions, trickery and treasonous nature, always placing their own priorities above all else, stating that we simple monkeys are ignorant to see the bigger picture of this and that prophecy and blah 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 blah, all while stabbing us in the back. So in a nutshell, although Craftworld Eldar and the Imperium of Mankind share many enemies and strive to defeat chaos, let's just say they don't get along very well. This is the tale of the Eldar race, how they came to be during the War in Heaven thanks to the Old Ones, how they conquered the galaxy, and how their fall into hedonism eventually led them down a spiral of decadence, culminating in the creation of the fourth Chaos God Slaanesh, which annihilated their great empire and doomed their race for eternity. What's left of the Eldar race is divided and slowly drifting into extinction. Maybe one day they might rise again from their ashes and defeat Slaanesh thanks to the Inari. However, that's a tale for another time. For the time being, despite slowly becoming extinct, the Eldar remain one of the greatest Xenos threats to the Imperium. Some of them can be reasoned with and quite possibly hold the key to defeating chaos hand in hand with mankind, while others only wish to inflict as much pain and suffering upon us as physically possible. Where the Eldar's ultimate destiny lies is still a complete mystery. However, they'll continue on their path and most definitely still have a great role to play in the fate of the galaxy. Well, there you have it, the tale of the Eldar. I believe I've covered most of their general history, and I hope to have painted a clear enough picture of the main Eldar factions. I'll make a shorter video on the rest in some time, but for now we'll continue on the 40k timeline and factions because we still have a long road ahead of us, and since in this video we've already delved into the birth of Slaanesh and the dangers of the temptations of chaos, I think we're ready to delve into the world of heresy and dive into the warp and the Chaos Gods. Anyway, that's all from me for now. If you liked the video, you know the drill. Give a like and subscribe for more content. Thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll meet again in the next video.